In May 2016, there was a survey published in Nature, a survey on more than 1,500 scientists' opinion. And they started the article saying that more than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiment. And what was even more worrying was that more than half of them had failed to reproduce their own experiment. So that was indeed called what they call the reproducibility crisis. So this emphasized the problem and importance of reproducibility in science. And for this session, we will have two excellent speakers. We will start with Laura Fortunato. So she's an associate professor of evolutionary anthropology at the University of Oxford. She is studying the evolution of human social and cultural behavior at the interface of anthropology and biology. She's a strong advocate of reproducible computational methods in research. And in 2016, she started the Reproducible Research Oxford project with the aim to foster a culture of reproducibility and open research at Oxford. So she's a member of many initiatives. She's also notably a member of the steering group of the UK Reproducibility Network and of the board of directors of the Software Freedom Conservancy. Thank you. Please, Laura.
Thank you very much. I promise I didn't put those words in there to be hard. So thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's great to be talking and learning about so many interesting projects and initiatives here in France and outside of the UK generally relating to open science. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm also not a statistician or a data scientist or a computer scientist. But I am a computational researcher. And the point I want to make with this disclaimer is that everybody here is a computational researcher. The moment you store data on your computer, the moment you process and analyze data on your machine, you are effectively a computational researcher. And so how you do your computing and think about your computing is important and a first step in working reproducibility. And this also leads me to another point that I like to make. We often talk about open science, and of course this is a workshop on open science. I like to talk about open research because I think these issues that we talk about affect also researchers who don't necessarily identify with science. For example, researchers in the humanity and social sciences. And so I like the open research label as more inclusive than open science. And then, of course, there is the open scholarship, which is this umbrella term that encompasses also open access, for example, alongside the open research practices. Now, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have, I guess this is my credentials, but also a few projects that I'm associated with and things I've been working on. And I'm putting these up here mostly for you to check later if you're interested. My work mainly has been in setting up and developing a project called Reproducible Research Oxford at the University of Oxford, which, as we heard, is an initiative to develop a culture of reproducibility at the university, and in particular focusing on training. And we started this project in 2016, so we've been going for a couple of years now. And in particular, we work with the Carpentries. Carpentries are an organization, a volunteer-based organization in the US, and their aim is to provide training to researchers in the basic programming and data management skills that researchers need to work in an open and reproducible way. So this is a resource that might be of interest to people interested in providing training. I've also been involved in a relatively new initiative which started in 2018, in September last year, called the UK Reducibility Network. The UKRN is looking to bring together the researchers with various stakeholders, including the funders and the publishers notably, but also the research councils in the UK, so the funders of research, to have a conversation about these topics so that we can solve them together and we can have a shared conversation. This is a very exciting initiative. It's also trying to bring together efforts across the UK so that we have one direction of travel as opposed to many different directions of travel. If you're faculty and in a position to provide training, this is another project that I'm involved in, Project TIA. TIA stands for Teaching Integrity and in Empirical Research. I put this up here because we are running a faculty development workshop at Oxford in March. And so for anybody who is in a position to teach and is interested in getting involved with reproducibility, this is one opportunity to do that. And then finally, I'm involved with the Software Freedom Conservancy, an organization that supports projects, open research, free and open research, free and open source software. My interest is in particular in trying to bridge that world with the academic world. So here, I'll have these, I have these up here mostly for people to check out as resources that may be of interest. Okay, now let me turn to what the problem is, the problem of reproducibility, and I'll define it loosely at first, and then we can look briefly at definitions. So, loosely defined, the problem is that in science, results can only be trusted if they can be reproduced by yourself now in 6 months, in a year's time, or by a different lab working independently. I use the term, What's going to happen? Okay, I use the term read-write here because, as we will see, there is some confusion around definitions, but loosely that's the issue. And so I've come to realize ultimately that however you define this, it's ultimately about trust. You read a paper, you want to know whether you can trust the result. And if you can't trust the result, then this raises questions about whether you can trust the researcher. Did the researcher make a genuine mistake? Or is the researcher trying to be dishonest about what he or she did to get the results that they published? And in turn, this relates to issues of trust in the process, because we grow up with this idea that science is this beautiful self-correcting process. But then if researchers cheat, for example, and the papers we read are not truthful for a variety of reasons, then we lose trust in that process that we all believe is a good way to go about finding out about the truth. Now, we've heard the term reproducibility crisis, which indicates that researchers are not so sure. So even if there isn't necessarily a crisis, there is a crisis of confidence. And this is some data showing the number of papers in the Scopus database that include a term relating to reproducibility in the title or abstract across different disciplines. Neurobiology is this pale green here, so it's here, and this is over a 40-year period. So you can see that in absolute number, the number of papers has increased, but also if you look at a 2-year period, the relative number of papers has also increased. Now, part of this is linked to the rise of a field of research called meta-research, or research on research, which looks to use the tools that we have and also the large bodies of data that we now have to understand the underlying process. And so we have a lot more insight into the incentives, for example, the reporting, the methods that people use, and so on. So this is partly driving this increased awareness in issues relating to reproducibility. But of course there is a growing concern, and so this is the inevitable XKCD here, just illustrating how every week, every month, we have some report of misconduct or alleged misconduct or something iffy about scientific results. This is a survey that was mentioned earlier. This is a survey published by Nature, 1,500–1,600 researchers, and they were asked whether they felt that there was a reproducibility crisis, and some 90% of researchers felt that there was a crisis. Some self-reporting, obviously, and self-selection going on here, but this is indicative that there is at least a crisis of confidence in the process. And of course, this is also picked up by the media and by the public. So this is one of many covers and that I could have picked to illustrate this issue and how these issues are portrayed in the popular media. Now, just a word of caution relating to this. These are the titles of 3 papers out of a special issue published in PNAS in March last year. And they illustrate some of the things that researchers are interested in. There's about 10-15 papers in that special issue. Of course, there seems to be this disconnect between this crisis narrative and the fact that the scientific process is producing progress, nevertheless. And so this is reflected in how we think about this and also in the narratives we tell. And this opinion piece was particularly interesting. The author, Daniele Fanelli, was effectively arguing that this crisis narrative may in fact even be damaging science because it undermines the confidence that the public has in the scientific process when the evidence for a crisis is in fact not as strong as we like to think. And so this is really, I put this up here just as a word of caution that when we talk about the problems with the scientific process, we have to be careful. And so to illustrate that, this is a report published by PNAS and the US National Academy of Sciences. A few months later in May of the same year, so May last year, another NAS, but this is the National Association of Scholars, a different organization, published this report. And this is a report on the irreproducibility crisis of modern science. And if you look at the table of contents, it's quite a long report. And if you look at the table of contents, all the issues that you might see discussed in the context of open science, open research, and reproducibility are there. But effectively, this is almost an attack on science. It's almost a, well, you see, these researchers are dishonest, and so we shouldn't really trust them. Hence, evidence for climate change is not really as robust as we think. So we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about these issues and how they are perceived by outside of the scientific community. And I think part of the confusion arises from the fact that both within fields and across fields, people have different definitions for reproducibility. A number of different terms are used, and so I'm just going to give you a run through of some ideas in the literature that I find particularly useful to think about these issues myself. So Peng in 2011 introduced this notion that there is a spectrum of reproducibility, and at one end of the spectrum we find reproducibility, which is where you can derive identical results with the same data, and at the other end of the spectrum you have replicability, where you can derive consistent results with new data or a different method. Now, what we're aiming for in science is replicability, because we want to get to the truth, and if there is an objective truth, then different approaches will lead us to the same consistent body of results. But this is the gold standard, but it's not necessarily attainable. You may not have the funding to send another satellite into space to collect an independent data set. You will not have the funding or the subjects to run a separate clinical trial. So while we can sort of aim for this, and this is the gold standard, this is the minimal attainable standard. This is what we as researchers can affect and aim for in our day-to-day work. A different framework to think about these issues, which I find helpful, is a framework introduced by Goodman et al. In 2016. And they talk about 3 levels. The first level is reproducibility, methods reproducibility, where the researchers provide enough details to reproduce the study procedures and data. So this is effectively equivalent to reproducibility in Peng's framework. Then they talk about results reproducibility, and this is the consistency of results across different approaches, different methods. So this is equivalent to, or analogous to, replicability in Peng's framework. And then there is a third level, which I think is really interesting, which is not really discussed quite as much, and they call this inferential reproducibility. And this is the idea that we will make similar inferences given the body of results that we have. And this, I think, is important because once we have resolved these 2 levels, right, so we know that these are the results that you get to with these data and different approaches, you can get to the same or consistent results. then we can disagree about the inferences that we make from those results. Interpretation effectively may differ, but it's very hard to have debates, sound debates about interpretation if the differences may be due to differences in how the research was implemented. So if we fix these two levels, then we can have sound and productive disagreements that will lead to scientific process. Again, this is not really discussed very much, but I think it's an important point. And then finally, a concept that was introduced by Philip Stark earlier last year, is this idea of reproducibility. One thing that we have direct control over is to document our our methods for others to exactly repeat the experiment or analysis that we are doing. And he terms this reproducibility because it's a prerequisite effectively for all the other things that come, reproducibility at different levels. And I'll leave you to read this, but the important point here is that this is a prerequisite for reproducibility, and importantly, it applies across disciplines. And so he gives an interesting analogy with a scientific recipe. Which details can you leave out? So if I give you a recipe for making a loaf of bread, I don't necessarily need to tell you the brand of yeast or flour that I use, but I need to tell you that you need yeast, flour, salt, and water. And so it's about understanding which detail can be left out from the description and which detail is crucial to, for others to be able to repeat your work. Now, another point which I've come to realize recently, and this is from talking to researchers in many different fields, is that there are many different points of views because different disciplines effectively focus on different things. So if you talk to psychologists, and this is a very good paper published by Marcus Minato and colleagues in 2017, then this is a standard view of what the issue is about. So this is a sort of diagram of the scientific method, starting from generating a hypothesis, designing the study, data collection, analysis, interpretation, and so on. And they highlight a number of different problems that may arise at different stages of that process and may affect the reproducibility of the results. So this is a view from psychology, but not everybody has the same issues. If you're working in maths, then you don't have problems about designing your experiments. You don't do experiments. If you're working in physics, often you have a lot of data, so low power is not necessarily an issue. And so this is, for example, a view from a different field. These are researchers from maths and computer science, where again, they don't have issues of with statistical implementation or experimental design, and they argue that failures to replicate are effectively essential to integration of different observations into a coherent theory. And so again, very different points of view, and just a sort of some food for thought, really. I'm just putting this out there because it can help us having useful conversations and productive conversation about what the issue is. Okay. So going back to where I started from this idea that it's about being able to trust results that are published, I think that a sort of a low-hanging fruit and something that as researchers we can really change and affect on our day-to-day, starting today, tomorrow when you go back to the lab, is in changing your approach to how you do your own work. And so many of us grew up in a world where you're sharing files over email or in a Dropbox, for example. You're updating the results in your Word document as you do the analysis, and you copy and paste them. And so you have these trails of mouse clicks going from your statistical software into your manuscript and sort of back and forth. And this is not reproducible. It's very hard to recreate those mouse trails once you've done them. It's hard to remember to update every single number in that manuscript if you get new data, if your data changes for some reason. So we can go from this way of working to a workflow that is fully reproducible, where the data are in some shared repository that the research group has access to. The scripts and analysis code is under version control, so it's clear who changed what, when, and why. The documents are updated dynamically. So as you run your analysis, this automatically updates the figures in your paper and so on. And so this is something that we can all implement, again, starting tomorrow. Now, if I have time, I will give some examples, just to give you a sense of that these are really things that you can do and that can have a big effect in how you report your data. Now, I'm giving you examples. I'm not picking on particular papers. My premise is that all papers have errors. My papers, I'm sure, have errors. It's a human thing to make mistakes, but hopefully they're genuine errors. But some errors are not really excusable. And so I'll give you some examples here of things that can be easily prevented. This is a paper that was published in Nature in 2005. This is an example of what I call a data management malfunction. It made the cover of Nature, which is a big deal. And what they did, what the researchers did, Will Brown and colleagues, they had people in Jamaica dance, and they then derived these stick figures from these, and then they asked subjects to rate the symmetry of the stick figures, and they used the symmetry ratings then they looked at the association between the symmetry ratings and ratings of attractiveness. And this links to some theory that symmetry during development is linked to the quality of your mother's womb, effectively, and so it's a proxy for quality. So finding evidence of this in humans was a big deal. Nature, cover of Nature. And this is an area that is close to my field, so I was a PhD student at the time, and I remember rumours started emerging about whether these results actually held. And it turns out that it didn't necessarily. There was a retraction a few years later. So the paper was retracted, and in the editorial that accompanies the retraction, one of the points that really sticks out is that effectively the authors cannot agree on which was the correct version of the data. And so this is a type of mistake that I think is not really excusable, and something that we can all do something about very easily. I have a couple more examples, but I don't have time. So I will stop here, and I'll be happy to talk about this and more later in the afternoon.